before we bring James Ambergy back in, I just want to say a big thank you to our stabilizers ad hoc committee. Um, I tell you, this is an interesting group of people, and I can't express enough just how interesting it is to listen to these professionals talk, and just the depth of knowledge and the information that they bring to the table. It really is a privilege to work with these brilliant individuals. Um, without a further ado, I want to bring in James Ambergy, who's going to start us off with discussing change requests related to cyanuric acid. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me share a screen with you here. All righty, everybody can see that, I hope.
We sure can.
Okay, good deal. So having just finished up the World Aquatic Health Conference last week, I'd like to encourage folks not to blow up the chat. I'm not going to be able to read and respond while I'm speaking, so just try to hold your questions to the end if you could. This is I think a very, as Dewey said, a lot of really smart people worked on this, which made it difficult because, when you have a lot of smart people trying to change all these things in small ways to benefit different interests, it gets to the point where it's pretty damn hard to understand sometimes even what's going on. So I'm going to try to simplify all these CRs by grouping them into what I'm calling an 8-pack. So I'm going to talk about 8 separate issues, and I'm going to start by talking about what's in the MAC right now. And that is to say, if you look in the MAC definitions, number 1, there's a definition of free available chlorine, FAC. And we might need to expand on that. Secondly, right now we're required in the MAC to measure CYA every 2 weeks. The minimum chlorine residual is 1 ppm, unless you have stabilizer, and then it's 2 ppm. The max concentration is currently 90 for CYA. The CYA use is banned currently in spas and therapy pools, with the concerns that, there may be biofilm issues or wound issues where stabilizer wouldn't be a good help. Number 6, the ratio in the current MAC varies from 10:1 to 45:1. I'm talking about the ratio of stabilizer to chlorine. And number 7, right now we don't educate operators on the impact of CYA that on HOCl. So we could add that to the training program. And last but not least, when do we close a pool? Right now, we close a stabilized pool if it drops below 2 parts per million free chlorine. So now, when we talk about the future MAC, we have lots of options, and that's what this presentation is all about today. And that is, do we move from talking about free available chlorine to DPDFC? And if so, what is that, and how do we decide how to vote on it? If we change the measuring frequency from 2 weeks, do we go to 1 week or 1 day? Similarly, can we change this minimum chlorine residual from the old 2 parts per million with stabilizer to 1? What should the maximum limit for CYA be? So lots of proposals here, anything from 25 to infinity. There's proposed bans. Some folks want to ban CYA in indoor pools. Other people want to lift the bans that are already there. When you look at the ratios have been proposed to range from about 2.5 to 50:1. And we've got to decide, where do we go? How do we balance the risk and the benefits, and what are those? So operator training, do we include the impact of CYA on HOCL? That's a yes or no. When do we close a pool? Is it based on a ratio? Is it based on a min or a max concentration? Is it based on both or either? All decisions that we'll have to make before the end of the talk. Now, the good news today is 4 of these 8 topics, I think, are pretty straightforward. And that is, they're kind of pick one, yes or no. And the other 4 topics are much less straightforward. As we look at the 4 that aren't straightforward, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. And sometimes there could be multiple answers. For example, if you think that 20 to 1 is a good ratio, then 30 to 1 or 15 to 1 might be equally good or similarly good. If you think that the closure limit should be 60 or 90, you could make an argument either direction. And those are things that we'll talk about as we move forward. So I'm going to try to wrap up the first order of business here, and that's the definition of free available chlorine and DPDFC. So change request 3.238 basically starts to realize that if you have cyanurate bound chlorine, CBC, then you can't regulate pools based on FAC. And this is just kind of updating that definition to say you have the free available chlorine, but you also have to consider the bound chlorine. And this is why this definition should change. And that's a pretty simple change. There's all kinds of, great reasons, why this should be. And, if you're not a chemist already, I'm not going to make you one today, but there are some graphs to help simplify things and define things, and I will show you a few of those. This graph is showing you how much of the chlorine that we put into the water here. So this is the free available chlorine over in the blue, and at 0 parts per million CYA, we have 100% of this in the water as HOCl and OCl minus, depending on what the pH is. Now, when we start adding cyanuric acid, we start to decrease the amount of free available chlorine to the point that, we could be as little as 1%. So depending on the pH and the cyanuric acid level, we could have a pool with 1 ppm of free chlorine that literally has, 0.01 milligrams per liter that's actually there and available to do disinfection. I'll introduce one more term here formally, and that's the ratio. So I'm calling this this ratio here and I'm just talking about the ratio of cyanuric acid, CYA, to the ratio of free chlorine as measured by DPD. So in this case, on this graph, if we're at 30 parts per million, we put a 30 here, and the free chlorine, or the DPD free chlorine, is 2. So when we divide 30 by 2, that's a 15 to 1 ratio, and that's what I'm defining here as the ratio. We'll talk about the ratio quite a bit today, but that's just an introduction to what I'm talking about, so you're not confused later. Now, I'm already getting kind of bored with these tedious slides, so I'm going to ease into a joke. Okay. So 50 members of a motorcycle gang go into a bar. 50 police officers are gathered in the donut shop next door. Now, the joke is that only one police officer can enter the bar at a time. So you guys can kind of see how this would be kind of a funny situation if you were in the bar, or if you were in the donut shop, or anywhere else. And this is my thinly veiled attempt at trying to explain how CYA works. And this is to say that, if you had 50 crypto come into a swimming pool and you had 50 chlorines there, but there was a donut shop next door called CYA, then, the chlorine would primarily stay in the donut shop, protected from sunlight. And just a small amount here, maybe as little as, 1% or 0.01 part per million, is actually in the water disinfecting the crypto. So this is kind of like, one police officer in a bar with, 50 potential troublemakers. It wouldn't be the same as if 50 were there. And, so CYA has both benefits and disadvantages. And it protects chlorine. It saves the residual and applies it when needed, but it doesn't overly free it. It doesn't overly apply it. Okay. Now, if we look at this change request, this is 57582 number 3, and the change request recommends changing the monitoring frequency for measuring CYA in the water. It's currently 2 weeks. This change request says do it every week. Okay, the TRC discussed this and voted for it. There was also a request that said we should measure it every day instead of every week, because if we're going to regulate based on it and things like that, then we need to know what it is. And TRC kind of said, well, this thing doesn't change very fast typically, so probably once a week is enough. And we had to make a decision. So now let me update you here. Of our 8-pack, we've already managed to knock 2 off the top here. We've defined chlorine better as to how it's actually being used, and we've said the monitoring frequency for CYA probably needs to go from every 2 weeks to weekly. And encouraged by my success, I'm going to jump into something that there are no change requests on. Okay, so number 3, there aren't any change requests on the minimum chlorine residual. This kind of gets involved in some change requests, but nobody's specifically asked to change this or independently asked to change it. So not specifically just in change requests, just trying to talk about how these things work. And, if you look at what's going on in the MAC right now, there is a ratio depending on what the CYA level is. And if the CYA level is 0, then 1 ppm of free chlorine is all that's required. And I'm going to call this a relative risk of 1. And if you start adding CYA, particularly if you add 90 parts per million to 2 parts per million, which is the current minimum, this 90/2 would be a 45-to-1 ratio, and that's the max ratio that's currently in the MAC. And the minimum ratio is probably somewhere around maybe here, maybe it's 20 and 2, because it's hard to measure much less than 20, and 20/2 would be a 10-to-1 ratio. So there's a range of ratios and there's a range of risks already in the Model Aquatic Health Code. And having a uniform ratio would help to stabilize some of that risk. So instead of having very risky conditions where this might be 45 times more risky than none, and this might be 10 times more risky than none, there's a kind of a gradient of risk depending on, the concentration of CYA. So having a fixed ratio would help even that out. Now, when people started making change requests, they didn't exactly follow the James Ambergy logic that I wish they had. And they started changing multiple things. So if we take this one, I'll show you what I mean by a two-faced change request. And it could be two-factor, I don't mean to imply that these are dirty or underhanded, even though they could be, and they could work in both directions. So there is a little bit of double entendre here. But in this change request, there's a ratio set, and the proposed ratio in this change request was 20-1. And the proposed change in chlorine went from 2 parts per million to 1 part per million, which is what it is for pools that don't have stabilizer. So actually the minimum free chlorine changed at the same time the ratio changed. And this two-faceted approach creates two impacts on the risk. And that is, if your ratio was 45-1 or higher, as it would be here, then you would lower the risk by having, for example, a 30-1 ratio. However, because you also lowered the minimum amount of free chlorine to 1, that increase and makes higher risk for all these pool scenarios. So this is what I'm saying is when we change two things, we can lower the risk, but we can also raise the risk. And which of those we do kind of depends on what you're looking at. And as if this wasn't complicated enough, let me complicate it. So now here is a total of 4 different scenarios. So we start with the current MAC, and we look at the ratios and the risk. So the current MAC would have a higher risk than any of these new ratios that we're proposing, whether it's 30-1 or 15-1. However, because of this 1 ppm minimum, there are multiple situations, like anytime the chlorine level, or I'm sorry, anytime the cyanuric acid is below 60 in this scenario, or below 30 in this scenario, you actually increase the risk of those pools. So you increase some risk, you decrease some risk, and you guys get to vote. You get to decide what you want to do. Now, I kind of am biased, and I'll state that up front, and I'm biased toward public health. I don't sell cyanuric acid. I don't affiliate with companies that do. And, I'm not trying to steer you toward company A or company B. I'm simply trying to steer you toward what makes sense in terms of public health. And to me, if you kept this 2 ppm ratio for pools, there would be no scenarios where it got more risky, and there would be multiple scenarios where it got less risky. And to me, this would be a change worth considering. And not to say that the other ones definitely aren't, but again, you have to decide. I'm just here to kind of guide the thought process. Now, if I were to sum this up, I would say that this would be the low cost option, and this option would cost more. And this option would have the highest risk, and this option would have the lowest risk. And you have to, again, decide, what do you value? Do you value, public health risk or the cost of operating a pool? And you can vote any way you please. I'm just trying to sort out, the factors and let you make up your mind. Now, getting back to the future 8-pack, we have to decide now, do we want to lower this to 1 ppm with a ratio, or do we want to keep it at 2 ppm where stabilized pools are in the current MAC, because it has a risk associated with it. And I'll let you guys decide what you want to do. In the meanwhile, I'm going to talk about, why do we have cyanuric acid? And the reason that we have cyanuric acid in pools is because it protects free chlorine from sunlight. So if you had a perfectly balanced, chemically balanced pool, and you have the sun come up in the morning and the sun takes all the free chlorine out of the water, it's no longer safe. And cyanuric acid would help block sunlight's degradation of the free chlorine. Now, the way this works is a little bit interesting, I think, in that, by the time you get to 30 parts per million free chlorine, you've already got almost all of the effect of protecting free chlorine. So you can increase to 60 or 90 or 180 parts, and really the protection from the sun doesn't change. There's a point of diminishing returns that occurs right there around 20 to 30 milligrams per liter. And this is just the way that cyanuric works. Now, some background information is that the CDC's Healthy Swimming Program provides guidance on how to respond to accidental fecal incidents or non-accidental fecal incidents, as the case may be. And the advice currently is, if you have more than 15 parts per million of cyanuric acid in the water, then you have to basically drain the pool until you get down below 15 parts per million. So if somebody has an accident or an incident in the pool and you have to hyperchlorinate, CDC says the only way that you can follow our guidelines is if the cyanuric levels are less than 15. Now, this isn't ridiculous in terms of the sun protection of cyanuric is here or here, depending on if you're at 15 or 30 parts. So it's not that big a difference in sun protection, but this difference would save you from having to drain 50% of the pool volume and fill it up with fresh water. So small differences can sometimes turn into big ones. If we look at where the regulations are now, the current MAC limits CYA levels to 90 parts per million. So if you were at 90 parts per million and you needed to go to 15, you would basically need to drain the pool. You wouldn't really have a way to do an accidental fecal response. Now, if you're thinking here, imagining what the change request would look like, where would you expect them to be? Would you expect the change request to lower this limit or to raise them? Well, consistent with everything that I've talked about, some people want them really low, some people want them really high, and some people want them somewhere in the middle of where they are and where they could be. And so there are change requests, and in this case, there's at least 4 different change requests, and they're all kind of mutually exclusive. You can pick any one to vote for, but you can't vote for all 4. You can't have 4 different limits. So we'll examine these in a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. But I'll try to explain that there are competing issues, there are competing factors, and these concerns basically drive all these change requests to extreme. Some of these are extremely low, some of these are extremely high, and some of these are kind of close to what we're doing right now. But I'll come back to that theme. Now, if we talk about the maximum concentration of cyanuric acid and why this is a concern, I can think of at least 4 reasons. One is that, if you have more than 15 parts per million, it's going to hinder your disinfection of chlorine-resistant pathogens like Giardia and Crypto. We just looked at the CDC where they said if you're above 15, don't hyperchlorinate, drain the pool and refill it. And secondly, there's no significant savings of chlorine above 30 parts per million. So if you're saying, I want to save chlorine, 30 parts per million will do that just about as well as any concentration. A third piece of information here is that ORP controllers, which are required by the MAC, start to have problems above 50 parts per million cyanuric acid. And by problems, I mean they can, the electrodes can foul and the signals can't get up to the set point, and basically they can just feed continuously. And we had a situation like this at the campus pool where the chlorine level got up to about 17 or 18 parts per million. And, people were complaining about their lungs and their bleached out bathing suits. It was right in the middle of summer, and we had a bunch of summer camps on campus, and, parents were calling in, and turned into a great big mess. And so runaway controllers are definitely a concern. Fourth, as we look at this ratio concept, the ratio concept, I'm just going to say, kind of stabilizes the risk that used to fluctuate. And this is a good thing, because basically it just says we're going to base this on the amount of hypochlorous acid that's present instead of either the concentration of free chlorine or the concentration of cyanuric acid. We're going to do this ratio approach so that the ratio is kind of an indicator of the risk. Now, what's kind of hidden with the ratio is that if you increase the chlorine level by 2 parts per million, let's say you're at 30 parts CYA and 1 part chlorine, that's a 30-to-1 ratio. So a 2 ppm increase would put you at a 10-to-1 ratio. Now, to make that same leap of 30-to-1 to 10-to-1 ratio to decrease the risk in the pool, that would require 6 parts per million if you started at 90. So the more cyanuric you have in the pool, the harder it is to increase the chlorine level. Now, that's just concerns on the low side of things. Now, if we look at proposed limits above 90 parts per million, and there are proposals to make changes to allow more than 90 parts per million cyanuric acid, we start to have some different types of limitations. First off, NSF test kits are normally only certified to a maximum of 110 parts per million. So if we wanted to have a limit of 180 or 300 or 450, we would have to perform dilutions, and those would have to be approved by NSF. So, currently, we have some accuracy issues with NSF tests. So if you're using the strips or the drops or pretty much anything but a photometer, the error of the measurement ranges from about 20 to 50%. And this is just what NSF lists on their certification. And if you look at this, plus or minus 50% of error, if you had 300 parts per million cyanuric, the plus or minus 50% would be 150 to 450. And if we look at this in terms of a ratio here, if we had 5 parts per million DPD free chlorine, the ratio would change from 30-to-1 to 90-to-1. And what I'm saying here is, if the ratio is set and not changing, our ability to measure it is limited by the test kits. So if the ratio didn't change at all, but you measured it 10 times, the answers could come back that you have a 30-to-1 ratio, 40-to-1, 50-to-1, 60-to-1, 70-to-1, 80-to-1, 90-to-1, all within the error of the test kit. So there are some issues to consider if we're going to regulate based on a cyanuric ratio. We have to be able to measure that accurately, and then these test kits may not be able to do that. Now, this is an increased risk if you set a ratio, but then you don't know what it is. I mean, sometimes it's going to be higher and sometimes lower, but whenever it's higher, the risk is going to be increased. And if you have a higher than the test kit can measure, you're going to have to train operators and inspectors to do dilutions and math and calculate these concentrations instead of just measuring them. Now, the same error applies whether we're above 90 or below 90 parts per million. So if we look at this same error of plus or minus 50%, if our reading was 30 parts per million and the error plus or minus 50%, this is our range, and this is what the ratios would be doing. So in this case, we actually have, and you can calculate this on your own, we actually have a 30-to-1 ratio. We have 30 parts CYA and 1 part DPDFC. That's a 30-to-1 ratio. That's been proposed as one of the changes. But now as we look at this, just in the error of the cyanuric measurement alone, we haven't talked about measurement of chlorine yet, but just in the error of the cyanuric alone, this ratio could vary anywhere from 15-to-1 to 45-to-1 based on what we're seeing from a test kit. And this could be a problem, for example, if the test kit that the regulator is using doesn't match the one that the operator's using. So a pool may think it's at 15-to-1 and really be at 45-to-1 and get in a lot of trouble when there's an inspection. So something to consider. Now, I'm going to fill you in on a little background information that I wasn't aware of when I voted on these change requests as a member of the TRC. And this first piece of information comes from the World Health Organization and their guidelines for recreational water. The World Health Organization has standards for drinking water and swimming pools and so forth. And generally, these are kind of global averages, if you will. They're not the most advanced or sophisticated. You know, these aren't the German DIN standard that we might think they would be. They're just kind of average and for everybody. And so I don't want you to think these are extreme. But for example, the World Health Organization guideline says the max limit for cyanuric acid should be kept below 117 parts per million. And this is based on toxicity concerns. And for operational concerns, they recommend 100 parts per million. And so there are independent regulations that kind of limit how much cyanuric should be in a pool globally by the World Health Organization that we might want to consider as we vote. Now, back to our 8-pack, I haven't covered anything new in a while. So the maximum concentration of cyanuric acid is currently 90 parts per million, and we can decide where to go with that. We can decide to lower that. We can decide to increase that, and that's what you guys will be voting on. And we'll kind of color code that as we go. So let's take a look at a change request on section number 5. And section number 5 of our 8-pack is about where do we ban cyanuric acid. So there was one change request that said it's already banned in spas and therapy pools. And I think that's a step in the right direction. I want to ban it in indoor pools. And, the concerns here are that, well, possibly, not a lot of research to support it, but possibly this could improve air quality if we had cyanuric in an indoor pool. Possibly this could improve an ORP controller's response at very low levels. You know, if the probe is finicky, perhaps, 2 or 5 parts per million of cyanuric would actually help the controller work better. So there could be some situations. So the TRC said, no, let's not ban it. Let's wait on better science to evolve and tell us that we need to ban it. And so the TRC voted no on this one. There was also a proposal to strike the existing bans. So right now you're not allowed to use cyanuric in spas and therapy pools. Somebody said, well, let's get rid of that. And the TRC said, well, we don't really know that much about cyanuric and biofilm. We have some concerns that that could be an issue, and until some of these things clear up, let's not change the existing ban and let's stay there. So as we look kind of at how we're voting so far, we've said probably we'll okay this definition. We'll change this monitoring to 1 week. There were no votes on this one. We've now said that we're going to vote for keeping the ban on spas and therapy pools, and kind of vote against the 2 change requests in that regard. And we'll get back to these maximum concentrations and ratios. But before we do, let me do kind of a countdown here. I want to explain to you that there's 3 types of pools. Okay, there's pools that don't use cyanuric acid. There's pools that do use cyanuric acid, but they add it independently. So you can get cyanuric acid without chlorine, or you can get cyanuric acid with chlorine. Now, the most common options here are just, you see in blue here, this is just plain CYA. You can add it to the water whenever you want, to whatever concentration you want, and it'll basically stay that concentration. You add the chlorine independently, and your ratio is basically stable. Now, a second way to do things is you buy the chlorine already attached to the CYA. So in this case, it's a combined product, and one of these is called trichlor. And with trichlor, you add the chlorine at the same time you add the cyanuric. And this is very convenient. The only kind of downside is every time you add chlorine, you increase your ratio, you increase your level of cyanuric acid. And so there are probably about an estimated 10% of pools that are in this category, mostly hotels, motels, and apartments, and typically in the 20 to 30,000 gallon range, because the feeders for this tend to be smallish. So counting down from 3 to 2, there's 2 types of chemical suppliers, and the 2 types of chemical suppliers are the ones that sell cyanuric acid stabilized products and the ones that don't. Okay. And so if you guys are going to chat and ask questions, I'll ask you to identify yourself. If you work for a company that sells cyanuric acid, put that in the chat. That way everybody can interpret your stance based on who you work for or who you have interest in. And if you're in a different company that doesn't sell cyanuric acid, include that in the chat so everybody's familiar, because the change requests have this information. You could see what person at what company submitted all these change requests. And a couple things you'll probably notice is, James Ambergy didn't submit any of them. And most of them come from either a company or a committee with people from those companies. And so it can be kind of cumbersome to look at who submitted it before you start trying to interpret it. And by interpret it, I do certainly mean that there's only one type of change request when it comes to CYA, and that is ones that are biased, tricky, and contentious. Because for every one that somebody likes, somebody else hates it. And some of these are tricky because they're two-faced. They make one good change and they turn around and make one bad change. And everybody is biased. If you work for chemical company A, you're biased against product A. If you work for chemical company B, you're biased in favor of it. And if you're James Ambergy or somebody that doesn't work for a chemical company, you're probably biased towards public health or cost or whatever your interests are. So let's just all admit that we're biased and move on. So there's lots of money to be made or lost by these chemical companies, and they have PhD level chemists writing these CRs. And they're a lot to deal with. They're hard to interpret. They're complex. And it's easy for a naive person or somebody that's less informed to be tricked by these CRs. And I say this because I was in this category. I mean, there's a number of these where I didn't know half the CR. I didn't know half the things that were going on. And sometimes I already voted, or I didn't have a chance to find these things out before I voted. And so, sometimes we all get tricked with these. So don't be embarrassed if you've been tricked. Let's just try to get it right before we vote. Let's be careful not to screw up all the commercial pools for the benefit of the companies that are selling chemicals to 10% of the commercial pools. And that's my major piece of advice as you vote is, vote for anything that you think is right. Just to understand that, we're talking about with CYA, a very small amount of pools, a very small percentage of pools that are using these combined products that are going to have these high levels. So, let's factor that in. Now, switching gears yet again, I'm going to talk about what is safe recreational water. Well, according to the World Health Organization, they think that the ORP level should be at least 720 millivolts. So if you have an ORP controller, as pools under the MAC are required to have, the World Health Organization says set it at 720 millivolts. Now, I pulled this data off of a controller website. So this is Santa Barbara Controls. They make the, I think it's the Chemtrol product. And they had some pH, ORP, chlorine level data. And what I did here in green is I just marked the areas where we can operate a pool. So between pH 7.2 and 7.8, and at an ORP of at least 720 millivolts, according to what the WHO guidelines said. And when we take a close look at this, we can see that if we're at pH 7.5, that 720 millivolts is only requiring 0.2 parts per million of free chlorine to get this ORP of 720. Now, if we look at this 0.2 line, I mean, this doesn't agree with what the MAC says is acceptable, but it's still within what the World Health Organization recommends. If we go up to 0.6 parts per million, we could see that all the way up to pH 7.8, 0.6 parts per million would still be enough to meet these WHO guidelines. And if we were at 3 parts per million, then we would be having an ORP of a little bit over 800. So this is just trying to put ORP into perspective, because this will give us a basis for comparing some of the ratios that we're going to be talking about in a minute. And this is another graph that I pulled off the internet. Again, I don't do CYA research. And but from this Aquatics International article by Williams and Young from 2013, I got this graph and I pulled some of these numbers off of it. So again, if we want a ORP of 720 millivolts or above, that's the green zone. We can see that with 1.5 parts per million of chlorine, with 0 cyanuric acid against this scale here, we're going to have an ORP of about 820, which is, about what we were looking at a minute ago. Now, as you start adding cyanuric acid at 10 parts per million, for example, you're going to reduce the amount of HOCl and the amount of disinfection as you add cyanuric acid. And this is that ratio concept I talked about. In this case, this graph is at 1.5 parts per million, DPDFC. And when we get to 15 parts per million here, this is a 10-to-1 ratio. So you can see at a ratio of 10-to-1, we have 720 millivolts, and this meets the World Health Organization guidelines. Similarly, if we look at a 10-to-1 ratio on the other side, we would expect a similar reading. And I'm going to estimate that this one's about 728 millivolts. Now, the 10-to-1 ratio on the other side is 40 parts per million CYA and 4 parts per million chlorine. but still the same ratio, still approximately the same ORP, still within WHO guidelines. Now, if we continue this, we'll see that the ORP levels drop outside of the WHO green zone as we increase these ratios. So if we go to a 20-to-1 ratio or even a 30-to-1 ratio, we see that we no longer get 720 millivolts. We don't even get 700 millivolts. I mean, these are actually below 680 or 660. So this one's about 650 millivolts. So as we change the ratio, we change the disinfection power of the chlorine. And that's all this is showing. Now at a 45-to-1 ratio, which is where the current MAC is, we can see that actually the ORP based on this would be that if we were at 70 parts per million and we had 2 parts per million free chlorine, actually all the lines blur together, but this will give us an ORP of about 640 millivolts. So this is an interesting way to look at the ratios in terms of the ORP that would be produced, with different amounts or different ratios of cyanuric acid to free chlorine. Now, I'm not the godfather of this concept or anything, but it has been applied in a number of different areas. So this is the CDC data where they looked at hyperchlorination of crypto and with different levels of CYA. And you can see that the ratios of CYA to DPD changed, and so did the disinfection. So in this case, this is where we get the CDC recommended values of 15,300 milligram per liter minutes. I just converted this to hours to show that it takes this long to hyperchlorinate a pool with no cyanuric acid. And when we start adding cyanuric acid, it's the ratio of cyanuric acid to chlorine that determines where the line goes. Does the line go here? Does the line go here? Does the line go here? Or does the line go here? And if we look at a 5-to-1 ratio, which is what we would have with 100 parts per million cyanuric and 20 parts per million free chlorine, we can see that we could really chlorinate for a long time. We could hyperchlorinate for 10 days and still not get 1 log reduction. So the cyanuric interferes with chlorine disinfection. I mean, this is no surprise. And this is where the ratio that we talked about a little bit already comes from, with 16 parts per million cyanuric and 20 of free chlorine, we get a ratio of 0.8, and this line comes down fairly close here, close enough that it wouldn't take forever to get a decent kill rate. And that's why the CDC put out these guidelines that says, if you're over 15 parts per million, you can either forget about it and drain the pool, or you can get down to an acceptable level, because the chlorine simply isn't going to work with this much cyanuric acid in the water. And I've already showed you this graph, but this is just a reminder. Now, just in case somebody thinks that I'm cherry picking data or something like that, I'm not. I just found graphs and data that I could get off the internet. So this is from Kennelly in 1974, and this is actually some. I'm going to show you one chart from some Biolab work. Now, Biolab, if you don't know, is the company that sells these things like trichlor. And so I wouldn't expect their data to be biased against their own product. So I have some confidence in this, but let's take a look, because this is a busy graph. And this is to say that the WHO guidelines here for ORP are 720, and this would be our green zone above this line. And this is what's happening here to the ORP. So this is brand X ORP electrode. And you can see what's happening is they're increasing the chlorine concentration based on amp titration. And they're going from basically 0.5 part per million to 1 to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 to 3. And as the chlorine goes up, they're looking at what happens to the ORP. Now, initially, it goes up quickly, and then it flattens off rapidly, and then it becomes, even more flat as this goes on. The thing that I want to point out here is that when we have 200 parts per million cyanuric acid, even at 6 parts per million or 5.5 or 5.75 parts per million free chlorine, we're still not even up to 700 millivolts. So our ORP is simply not going to hit our target of 700 or 720 or whatever it might be if we have high amounts of cyanuric acid. And by high amounts, I just mean, in this case, 200 parts per million, which is greater than what the MAC currently allows. All right, getting back to our MAC 8-pack. We established these CYA usage bands. We're talking about this ratio, and we have to decide, based on the 10-to-1 to 45-to-1 ratio that we currently have, what do we want in the future? So there are proposals for 15-to-1, 20-to-1, 30-to-1, and 50-to-1 for us to choose between. But I'm going to change gears a little bit here and talk about showing curves of the impact of CYA on HOCl concentration. So, we've talked a little bit about how CYA impacts the HOCl concentration, and the TRC felt that this would be a good thing for operators to understand if they're going to operate swimming pools. So I would recommend that you vote for this change request, which is to increase operator training to include that. Now, things get a little more complicated here on item number 8. And by a little more complicated, I mean, when we're talking about immediate closure of a pool, we have to decide, is it based on a ratio? And if so, what is that ratio? And is it based on a CYA limit? And if so, what is that limit? And if we don't have either or both of these, because we can have both or either, depending on if we put an and or between them, the MAC is going to default to the ratio selected in item number 6. So whatever ratio that you might vote for here, let's just say that you picked a 30-to-1 ratio, the MAC would automatically close if you exceeded the 30-to-1 ratio, unless you put a 45-to-1 ratio in here. And then you get to decide whether or not, this word is 45-to-1 and or a certain CYA limit. Now, as we look at one of these change requests here, the wording can be extraordinarily complex, and by that I mean we're talking about the following minimum disinfectant residual. So the minimum disinfectant residual is below 1 part per million. So, how you read these, how you interpret these can be important to how you vote. So is it saying that you have to be below 1 or you can't be below 1? It's not totally clear. And if I say it has to be below 1 or it can't be below 1, it can't be below 1 while also exceeding a 45-to-1 ratio. So was that an and or an or? And do I want you to exceed the ratio or stay below it? And some of these, are just this complicated. So try not to get caught up in the words, because you can change the wording, but understand that these things have 2 different changes in many cases. So this one has a 1 ppm limit, a 45-to-1 ratio, and a 300 ppm limit. So this particular change request is 3 change requests in one. And this became very challenging for the TRC to vote, because if you like one thing or you don't like another, you don't really get the choice. It's not a la carte. You can't say, well, you know, I kind of like this change. I kind of like this change, but I don't like this one. And instead of this, I like 2 parts per million. You know, it's not Burger King. You can't get it your way. You just have a limited number of these to vote on, and you have to decide, is this change request better than that one? And the situation the TRC was in is we didn't write any of the change requests. So we're kind of stuck voting sometimes on 3 different change requests in one, and trying to figure out which one of three or four change requests actually makes the most sense. So, you know, you get the same challenge at your conference here. And I'll just say that the TRC voted yes on this particular change request. And the next change request I thought was much more simple. It said, if you're below 1 part per million or your ratio exceeds 45:1, you close the pool. Now, I understand this one. I'm not sure I ever understood the one before it. I just kind of hoped that those numbers would end up something like this. Now, this one doesn't have a max limit. So there is no max CYA limit of 300 or 90 or anything in this change request. But anyway, this was voted by the TRC with a no vote, because we chose the more complicated one that you just saw. And if we look further here, there's a second change request that actually proposes a limit. So it says the operational limit should be the closure limit, and that should be 90 parts per million in this case. That's not the 90 isn't in the change request. I just filled that in there. And so as we look at this kind of group of change requests, you know, we have to decide here: do we vote for a 45:1 ratio? Do we vote for 300 parts per million? Is it going to be 1 or 2 parts per million free chlorine? And if we don't do any of these, then we default to whatever ratio was selected up here in item number 6. So if you picked a 30:1 ratio, then this again defaults to 30:1 if you don't set something new here. So yeah, welcome to voting. It's not all that simple. Now, I want to confess some things that I didn't know when I voted. And these are things that, as far as I know, that the TRC wasn't aware of, but I want to make you aware of before you vote. And one of these things is toxicity limits. So there is an NSF report that says the toxicity limit is 300 parts per million for CYA, but there's also a World Health Organization limit of 117 parts per million. So you kind of got to decide which limit you put more stock in, which is evolution, which is revolution. The MAC requires ORP controllers, but ORP controllers have trouble above 50 parts per million CYA. So do we require a higher limit than what the required ORP controllers are expected to function well at? CYA test accuracy. If the closest that we can measure a 30:1 ratio is plus or minus 15:1, and we can't tell if it's 30:1, 15:1, or 45:1, I'm not sure we can require a ratio. You know, or maybe we just hope the law of averages behaves, or people buy the best test kits. Fourth, I wasn't aware of these World Health Organization guidelines on ORP of 720 millivolts. Now, I went back and I double checked with manufacturers to see if the manufacturers had similar limits, and manufacturers recommend 700 to 720 millivolts. So, this gave me encouragement that, that a lot of people are on the same page. Maybe just none of these manufacturers are writing change requests. And the fifth and final piece of information that I wasn't aware of when I voted was that ORP actually fouls, I'm sorry, CYA fouls ORP electrodes rather rapidly in just a few days. So what happens is if the ORP fouls the electrodes, you get a declining reading. Because it's a set point controller, you feed chlorine until you get back up to that set point. But in some cases with fouling, it just goes down and never comes back up. And this could lead to an overfeed situation like I told you about on the campus pool. Now, the WHO guidelines are shown here, and it just says, based on their risk calculations, this is the max that they recommended based on toxicity. And this is the max that they recommend based on operations. Now, just showing you this slide again, because I probably forgot to delete one or the other, but I'm not going to talk about it twice. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what the manufacturers recommend for their cyanuric acid controllers. So if you look on the Pentair website, who makes controllers, you'll see that they recommend cyanuric between 30 and 50 parts per million. If you look at the graph that we looked at earlier, you can see that it actually maxes out at 30 parts per million. If you look at the point of diminishing returns for protecting chlorine from sunlight, it's around 30 parts per million. If we think back to the ratio here that the CDC showed us, it's even less than 30 parts per million. So you see a lot of situations where 30 parts per million keeps coming up as a high number. And here's one with a higher number, 70 parts per million. And what this graph shows is that at 70 parts per million of CYA, none of the chlorine levels are really doing much. So between 1.5 and 4, there's not really much change in the ORP, and it's all around 640 millivolts. So this is a little bit, I think, disconcerting that, some people are proposing CYA limits of 180 or 300 or 450 parts per million when, the chlorine doesn't work very well at these levels. We've already talked about if we stay below 90 parts per million, which is where the current MAC is, we still have to contend with the error in measurement that's associated with this ratio. Now, this is taken from chemical controller websites here. And this just says, what I've already told you is, depending on if you ask Hayward or Santa Barbara Controls, they're recommending 700 to 720 millivolts for their controllers. And they're even saying at 750 millivolts, you can get rapid E. coli kill off. I'm sorry about that. So, this is consistent with what the World Health Organization recommended at 720. This is not consistent with the ratios that are being recommended in some of the change requests. So 20-to-1 ratios, 30-to-1 ratios are not consistent with an ORP of 720 millivolts or higher. So these are things to consider as you go to vote. We talked about the concerns with max concentration from, hindering accidental fecal release response to, not saving more chlorine, to interfering with controllers, to kind of tying the hands of the operators that if they want to make a ratio change, it may take 6 parts per million instead of 2 parts per million increase. So if you wanted to do a burnout to try to improve the air quality or shock the algae or whatever, it requires more and more chlorine to do these sorts of things. Now, there was a ratio that did seem consistent, and that ratio was 10 to 1. However, this ratio was not proposed in any of the change requests. And this information was not made available to the TRC. But it is being made available to you. You're welcome to change these things, at this conference if you want to change these things. If you like higher numbers than 10 to 1, like 100 to 1, you're welcome to go that way too. All that I'm going to say about this is if you picked a 15 to 1 ratio, that's probably what it would take to guarantee a 45 to 1 ratio. So, as you look at this, if you want to be sure you stay below something, think about the error in the method. Think about what you're trying to do. You might have to pick a lower ratio just to guarantee a higher ratio. So for example, if you wanted 30 to 1, you might pick or vote for 15 to 1 just to guarantee that with error, you're not over what the MAC already requires, which is a 45 to 1 ratio. So again, lots of things that we didn't know at the time, but there's also things that we know for sure. And the things that we know for sure include that HOCl is the primary disinfectant in pools. I don't think anybody's arguing that one. I don't think anybody's going to argue that CYA lowers the HOCl concentration. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It binds up the chlorine to protect it from sunlight. It's like the donut shop with the cops, okay? It keeps them from getting the sunburn, makes them happy with the donuts, and then they still continue to work one at a time as the other chlorine gets dissipated. Now, with cyanuric acid, it takes longer to kill pathogens. Longer kill times increase the risk of illness. Now, there are lots of models and lots of debates and lots of conversations around what model is accurate and what term, I don't think any model is accurate. I don't think we can base anything on the absolute risk. We have to base it on relative risk. If you do something that increases your risk, like, if you go out and sniff gasoline for the next hour out of your car, that's going to increase your risk of cancer. Doesn't guarantee you're going to get it, but it's pretty highly accepted that it's not going to do you any good. It's a risk, and you have to decide how much additional risk is acceptable and vote for it. Now, when you're asking how much chlorine is acceptable, well, if you look at the chemistry of chlorine, you know that you have HOCl and OCl minus, and that at pH 7.5, it's a 50-50 split. So if you have 1 ppm of DPDFC, then you have half a part per million of each, and we could call that the minimum. And this is without any cyanuric acid. As we start to add cyanuric acid, let's say we pick a 10 to 1 ratio, this ratio goes down by a factor of 10. Instead of being 0.5, it's 0.05. And if we pick a ratio of 50 to 1, it goes down to 0.01. So if you think about, this number in particular, is a hundredth of a part per million enough HOCl to disinfect your pool? You decide. Maybe it takes 200ths or 300ths or 500ths. Maybe it requires more. Maybe it requires less. And, you can debate this. I don't know the answer. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm simply saying that the more cyanuric acid you have, the higher the ratio, the higher the risk, and the less the HOCl. You got to decide what risk is acceptable and vote for it. Toxicity limits. Do you believe NSF? Do you believe the World Health Organization? You get to choose. Operational limits. Do you trust the World Health Organization? Do you want to stick with what the MAC has? Or do you want to go with the ORP manufacturer's recommendations here? Because it's their equipment that's going to be controlling the chlorine feed. How do you deal with the air in the test kit? 20 to 50% air is significant. What do you do with it? When do you close a pool? Do you close it based on 1 part per million or 2? Do you close it based on a ratio of 15 to 1 or 30 to 1? Do you close when it gets above 90 parts per million or 100 parts per million? These are the decisions that you're going to have to make, that you get to vote on. I'm going to remind you of a few things quickly. Because of the way the change requests are written, there's typically 2 and sometimes 3 changes that can be competing. With the ratio change request, some pools would get safer in green and some pools would get less safe in red. So the ratio approach in itself, whether you like a 30 to 1 ratio or a 15 to 1 ratio, makes some of the pools less risky and some of the pools more risky because it was written with a change in the minimum free chlorine concentration. Now, if you didn't like that change, you could rewrite it. You could actually say it has to stay at 2 with cyanuric acid, which is what it was or what it is now. And in that case, the ratio only decreases risk. Just nobody proposed that. So you would have to change a change request to be able to vote for that now. With no cyanuric acid, there's no problem meeting the ORP limits set by the World Health Organization. However, with cyanuric acid, it can be challenging. At a 10 to 1 ratio, you're right on that borderline of being able to meet the ORP guidelines. At a 20 to 1 or 30 to 1 ratio, you probably have no chance of meeting those. So if you trust those guidelines, if you trust the controller manufacturers, understand that you're going to screw them over or you're going to screw up the equipment by requiring ratios or allowing ratios that won't allow set points to be reached. And the higher the set point, like where we are currently, the worse it is. So I would say that, the current MAC allowing a 45 to 1 ratio is abysmal in terms of the water quality in these pools and the protection of public health. If you're going to hyperchlorinate in a pool, you have to be aware of the ratio and the limit. I've gone through all this stuff. You've seen it all. Now, I'm going to reward myself by telling another joke. Okay, I saw this slide at the World Aquatic Health Conference last week, and I just laughed my ass off because I thought it was the most hilarious thing I'd seen in a long time. And so I got a copy of it off the internet, and I used that one slide here so I can tell this one joke. But you guys have to promise that the joke goes no further than this room. There are serious implications if this thing gets out. So this slide says that with a 15 to 1 ratio of cyanuric acid to DPDFC, which is one of the changes that's been proposed, that the free chlorine kill times for Giardia are calculated to be longer than with 1 part per million monochloramine. Okay, so I showed this to my son and I said, well, isn't this the funniest thing you've ever seen? And he just looked at me like I had 2 heads. And this was payback because he's all the time showing me memes and I don't know what the hell they mean. So I got him back with this scientific slide. But the joke here is, and if you're using a ratio of 15 to 1 or higher, then 1 part per million of monochloramine would be a more effective disinfectant than the free chlorine, than the HOCl. So your primary disinfectant would actually shift from HOCl to monochloramine. And naturally there wouldn't be monochloramine in the pool, but if you peed in it, then there would be. So the joke that was playing in my head here is if you want to make a pool with a 15 to 1 ratio or higher safe, you just jump in it and pee. And then that way the primary disinfectant can become monochloramine, and then you won't have to worry about the ratio. So the ratio concept is I think a good one. It is scientifically sound and I fully support it. And I don't mean to cast any shade on that. I really like the ratio concept. in practice, there are some limitations. But I say, don't let this get out, because if people start thinking that the only way to make pools safe is to pee in them, then I don't want to swim in these pools anymore. And there's, huge air quality concerns and so forth. And understand this is a joke. I'm not actually suggesting it. All right. So back to the talk. There are a bunch of things that I didn't know when I voted, but you guys know these things now. There are a lot of questions that are going to be tough to answer, but you have to answer them. Now, what I'll tell you is how the TRC voted, and then I'll tell you how I would vote today if I knew everything that I know now, everything that you know. But you'll have to decide where you vote. So and I apologize in advance if I've got anything wrong. It's entirely possible that some little something somewhere on these slides, because there are so many things and I had to do them so quickly, that something could be an error, but I think it's all correct. And that is, the TRC voted to change the definition of free chlorine to DPDFC, change the measuring frequency for cyanuric acid from 2 weeks to 1 week, to change the minimum chlorine residual, even though it wasn't proposed, inadvertently by a ratio concept, to 1 part per million. The maximum CYA concentration is currently at 90 parts per million. And I don't believe any of these other change requests were voted for. The CYA usage is banned in spas and therapy pools, and that didn't change with the change request. The ratio, the TRC voted for a 30-to-1 ratio, which is kind of mid-range, and we thought more evolution than revolution. The operator training we voted in favor of, and the closure ratio, we voted for a 45-to-1 closure ratio, or a 300 ppm toxicity limit. Now, I say this because at the time we voted, we weren't aware, or at least I didn't hear anybody say it, and I wasn't aware that there was a World Health Organization guideline for 117 parts per million based on toxicity that the NSF study was competing against. So, based on that, I'm not sure I would make the same vote today, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, if you want a cheat sheet, I tried to get all this right. These are the, 18 or 19 change requests that the TRC voted on related to CYA. You're welcome to take a picture of this on your phone or screenshot it or whatever you want to do right now. But this is how the TRC voted on all these issues to the best of my knowledge. And I tried to be as accurate as possible. And this is just, again, like I said, in some cases you had to have the 300 ppm limit with the 1 ppm limit with the 45-to-1 ratio with an and or an or in between. So you didn't get to go a la carte if you were the TRC, but you guys can actually make changes to these if you see this as being warranted. Now, if I were to vote today, I would vote differently. I would still vote for the DPD definition. I would still vote for the 1 week monitoring. I would not vote for this. I definitely wouldn't recommend lowering the CYA. Lowering the free chlorine concentration with CYA, because there's so much air in the test kits, and this is going to increase the risk of a lot of pools, and there's no reason to do that. So even though there was no change request on number 3, there were multiple change requests that tried to do this. I would not support that. Number 4, the current MAC limit on CYA is 90 parts per million, and I would still go for that, even though you can make a good case for these lower limits, particularly 25, 40, and 60. If everybody in my group wanted to vote for any of those, I would go with them. But, I don't think that 90 is the end of the world. The World Health Organization is still at 100. And the reason that we had 90 to start with was because test methods. Can you tell the difference between 90 and 100? And if you can't, then you never know if you're over. So that's kind of where the 90 came from, and it's probably still valid. I would vote the same on these bands by not changing them. The DPD ratio, I originally voted here for this 30-1, but based on the error and the problems with ORP and the limited ORP ratios, I would definitely change that to a 15-1 vote if I were voting today. The operator training, I would certainly still vote for. And as I went to change this, I think a 45-1 ratio for closure is probably still reasonable. I think that should be or a 90 ppm limit. And again, this is based on the World Health Organization guideline for toxicity of cyanuric acid, and also the operational guidelines, the operation of ORP controllers, which have trouble above 50 parts per million, and the inability to achieve ORP set points in the acceptable ranges at higher levels. So that's kind of how I would vote today. If you want to take a picture of this one, you're welcome to do so. This is how I would vote today. And the green shows you everything I would vote for, the red, everything I'd vote against. And this one also shows you some revisions. So there's two revisions that I'll point out. One here, and that is to change this minimum from 1 to 2 parts per million to make sure that this is an or, and to revise this also to 2 parts per million, consistent with up here. So I would recommend a 15-1 ratio and changing to 2 parts per million as the minimum free chlorine, so that the risk isn't increased and the public health risk isn't increased in pools. This is not TRC recommendation. This is James Ambergy talking. It's just what I would do, knowing what I've learned since I voted on these things. But these things are not in the change requests. The change requests are very one-sided. They only present one side of information, and you got to go figure out the other side on your own. And that's unfortunate. I've got a couple more slides because I forgot one of the change requests, this last one here, the form stool response. So the form stool response, there was a recommendation to change this because what the MAC says now is that if you need to chlorinate for Giardia at 45 ppm with no cyanuric acid. And I think it says you need to double the time if you have cyanuric acid. But we already know the ratio concept, and we know that that's flawed. If you increase the ratio, you decrease the disinfection power, and that's what we saw in the CDC's data there a little bit ago. And with that being said, this is really a good change, but perhaps it's this calculation that's so complicated, or perhaps it's that the CDC should be making these recommendations. The TRC recommended a no vote, and recommended that the CDC make this recommendation. So I'll leave you guys with this slide here of all the things that I've learned recently since I voted, and I'll open the floor to any questions. And I'm not going to guarantee that I can answer them because, again, I'm not a CYA researcher. I just learned all these things for this presentation. So thanks for your time and attention, and I'll be glad to take any questions or corrections. I'm sure that in all these 99 slides I just presented, I had an error or two. So feel free to correct me publicly and disagree with me if you must. If you must disagree, though, please state your affiliation. I work for Company X, and I think you're a rat bastard. I'll be happy with that. I'll shut up. Questions?
Yeah, James, thank you for that very interesting and invigorating and enlightening presentation. At this point, I'd like to call on Richard Falk and Richard is a member of the cyanuric acid or the stabilizer ad hoc committee for CMAC. Also, one of the authors of a paper that discusses the cyanuric acid ratio that was published in Water back in, I believe it was 2019, possibly. Richard, you come to the floor, please, and we'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes to do a brief discussion.
Okay, you want me to do this first because you could also have Chip Latchley, who led the committee.
Yeah, Richard, go ahead and go first and just kind of talk about, model stuff. And then if Chip wants to speak, Chip can definitely welcome to.
So the first thing is, can I share my screen?
Yes, if we can, let's see, I don't have host. If Susan or Christy could give Richard presentation capabilities.
I'll stop sharing here. That may.
Perfect. Thanks, James. I was just going to say that.
Host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Now, Richard, is this a question for me or are you presenting an alternate viewpoint or something here?
I'm just going to show a slide about ORP because a lot of the stuff you had was about ORP. So
yeah,
yep,
sure.
Richard, very quickly, let me interject here, just so everyone's aware, we are at the end of our allotted time, and we're about to hit a scheduled break. We'll go through the next few minutes up until 4:45, and then we'll take our scheduled break from 4:45 to 5, and then we'll break off into caucusing rooms. This is a really important topic, and it's really a lot of information to decompress, and we would be doing a disservice to push too hard to stop the conversation. As we move forward, please remember that there'll be a 3-minute window or 3 minutes for individuals to comment. We will be holding to that strict 3 minutes. Apart from the 3 to 5 that we're allowing Richard as one of the primary authors of the paper. And we will move on to the next commenter. If you have comments to make and we're unable to get the comments in, please remember to direct towards Friday, where we will have an open comment period starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, so because a significant part of James's presentation talked about ORP, I want to just talk about that first, get that off the table. So what I'm going to show you is from years ago from Jeff Ludeman, who looked at a large number, 620 samples from 194 pools in Bloomington and Richfield, Minnesota in the 2004-2007 timeframe. And it showed as expected that the ORP and free chlorine, would be the DPD free chlorine, that is chlorine measured in test kits, didn't correlate particularly well with ORP. And the reason is that most of these pools had cyanuric acid in them. So he contacted me at the time, and of course I had been working in the chemistry of this with looking at hypochlorous acid, and gave him info and he gave me info, and we shared for replotting this with hypochlorous acid, which was the basis of our paper. In other words, our paper didn't look at ORP, our paper looked at hypochlorous acid. So this is, if you look at the hypochlorous acid in all these pools, the pools up here on the upper right were unstabilized pools. The ones below with the colored dots and then the non-colored ones to the lower left all had varying levels of cyanuric acid. And you can see that the correlation is better, although not perfect. It's actually quite noisy. In addition, James had a portable ORP sensor that he calibrated and weighted to calibrate 30 minutes in each pool, also clean the unit periodically and so on, and found that about a third of the pools, or more than a quarter of the pools, between a quarter and a third of the pools, had 100 millivolts or more difference between the ORP sensor that was built into in the particular pool versus his portable unit. So between the variability here and that, I just want to point out that ORP is not, repeat, not reliable as an absolute measure of the water quality. It was with respect to the water quality as it is defined with hypochlorous acid concentration in terms of disinfection. And 100 millivolts, by the way, is almost a factor of 10 difference in chlorine level, okay? So, or HOCl level, where if you didn't have cyanuric acid, it would be a factor of 10 of free chlorine by itself. So we're talking about a huge error. So all that was discussed based on ORP, delete it from your head. ORP is great for process control, and that's it. This is why every state requires at least daily measurement from a test kit of chlorine. And then as far as your ORP controller is concerned, you adjust your set point based on the truth from the test kits, not the other way around. So I'm going to stop sharing, and if you could put back the slide that James, you put back your slide of what you didn't know, please.
Oh, you want me to share again?
Yeah, share again that slide so I can talk to that.
Sure. Let me see.
So the main point being, though, that our paper focused on hypochlorous acid and showed that it is the primary chemical that does the disinfection, and showed that with both bacteria and with the crypto data that came from the CDC. So the other main point is the CYA test accuracy. So the CYA test accuracy, we did see a concern where the NSF the problem was more with the NSF standard, not with the actual test kit accuracy. The test kit accuracy was already well known and measured. There was a presentation last year from World Aquatic Health Conference from Kirk Mitchell using cyanuric acid turbidimetric and comparison test kits that showed that if you get the turbidimetric one within a middle range, you can actually be very reasonably accurate. And the test kit manufacturers tend to quote about a plus or minus 15 part per million or 20%, not more than 20% error. It's not 50%. The problem is the NSF standard 50 defines the levels such that they don't have a percent with the greater of a percent or absolute. And so I am now on the task force with NSF standard 50 to address that. I submitted it's equivalent of a change request, but for the NSF standard. And so we'll try to get that cleaned up. So it's not as bad as 50% is my point. We're not talking about test strips. Okay, we're talking about this would be like the Taylor Lamott as well as the electronic ones. Do better than that. ORP we talked about. This is all about ORP. So if you have a ORP sensor and you're concerned about fouling, no one is saying that you have to use higher cyanuric acid levels. None of our proposals, in fact, all of the proposals, not just ours, but all these CRs are not about, or all the ratio ones at least, they're not about changing the amount of chlorine you actually use necessarily in your operations unless you're below the new minimum that's defined. In other words, they're changing the minimum chlorine required for a given cyanuric acid level. If that minimum is now lower than what you're running today, you don't have to operate at it. It's not an operational target or goal. It's a minimum that we did as a ratio to make the disinfection consistent, at least until you get to no cyanuric acid. When you get to no cyanuric acid, the disinfection rate goes way up because you can't maintain a low 0.02 ppm, for example, a milligram per liter, in a pool. That's not practical. And even in the US, it would be difficult to do what Europe does, where they go low to like 0.3 to 0.6 in the DIN 19643 standard. That would be a challenge in most of the US pools because because of the design of the US pools, most of the US pools that have a difficulty of maintaining a very low chlorine level. So 1 ppm is more to not run out of chlorine, given the relatively poor circulation of many pools, is really what that comes down to. So
Richard, we're coming up on the 5-minute mark.
okay, so all right, so I just wanted to counter this. It's not that there's hidden part. Oh, the other part, the hidden, not being hidden, was the World Health Organization toxicity standard. So yeah, that's 100 milliliters for a 12 to 18 month toddler to drink, is what that's based on. And that is not what the EPA uses with their swim model. It's not just NSF. The EPA has a swim model, and that's where the NSF model is using numbers based on that. And the swim model is, you know, a reasonable agreed standard to use. So it's not that this was just taken from a industry standard. I don't think I have enough time to go through the paper part. I will do that in my caucus that I'm in for anyone that has questions. What I would say, Dewey, is quite frankly, because I think this was somewhat a bit of a wasted opportunity with some of this. Well, this session was just supposed to present the CRs and what they were. I think as far as an educational opportunity with respect to not just the paper, but just, you know, any technical questions that people have about what does this mean, that really needs its own session. And I'd be happy to do that with other members of the ad hoc committee, or with Chip and Laura and so on. But we're not going to have enough time to do that now.
Great. Thank you, Richard. I'd like to recognize Chip Blatchley. Dr. Blatchley, we mentioned this morning, did some astounding work on indoor air quality. He also, in his spare time, was the chair for the Stabilizer Ad Hoc Committee. Dr. Blatchley?
Thank you, Dewey. I mean, just a couple comments to build on Richard's comments. First, just for background, I mean, the committee that Richard and I were both members of was formed several years ago and includes a broad range of perspectives. So we deliberated for a number of years on really the science that informed the change requests that we put together as a committee. And those change requests were based on, you know, sort of a balance of the perspectives among the people within the committee. In addition, the change requests themselves do call for changes to multiple parts of things, but that's really in recognition of the fact that there's many aspects of this issue that are connected. Changing one without changing the other just doesn't make sense in many cases. So the change requests that we assembled were really assembled from a holistic perspective. Based on what we've been evaluating for the last several years, where do we think this should go? And again, those change requests represent a consensus of the committee itself. So, I mean, I guess I would just sort of leave it at that these change requests, these were not something that we, you know, sort of put together in a haphazard way. This was done after many years of deliberation regarding the science.
James, put the one, you're on the wrong slide, James. You're on your slide. Could you put the one before it, which is the one that the committee proposal, the TRC vote yes ones? Because that's what Chip is just talking about.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can find it.
There it is. That's it.
Okay, sorry. But yeah, I would like to say that, you know, before this committee's work, you know, I mean, before the model that you guys produce with the ratio and things like that, you know, I think I would have voted entirely against having CYA in pools, period. You know, kind of like the state of New York does currently. But, you know, I think your work is groundbreaking. I think it is enlightening, and I'm terribly impressed with it. Now, it's also contentious. You know, you have people pushing one way and people pushing the other, people putting out independent change requests separate from the committee. And that creates a lot of this confusion. And I was trying to educate people today of what the change requests are and how they're related and how they might decide on them. which is tremendously difficult for me because I'm not a CYA chemist. This is not what I do for a living. I had to learn all this. And a lot of this shit, though, was missing from the change request. People would submit change requests and say, oh, this is the NSF limit for toxicity. There is nothing else to be concerned with. And then you go and search and you're like, oh, well, there already are toxicity limits. And then you have to evaluate and compare. And it just seems like it's unduly complicated to try to figure these things out unless you are, on this committee, unless you are in the very elite environmental chemists working with swimming pools. So thanks a lot for everybody's work and comments, and don't hesitate to criticize me if I got things wrong. Again, I probably made some mistakes. I think there were a couple of these. I just got a private chat message that said there were one or two of these where the committee didn't reach consensus. So it wasn't a no vote. It was just not a consensus. And I'm not sure.
It was the one that was the ratio one, the 30-to-1 had one dissent.
Yeah. Okay, guys, I want to interrupt for a second because we have someone else that is wanting to speak. First off, just a point of clarification from the CMAQ aspect, right? We always look to try to find the brightest and the best in the industry to work with us and on our committees, and also on obviously the TRC, TSCs. And one thing we value highly is independent thought. So please do be aware that some of the, as James was very, very open about, some of the things that he discussed in his presentation was coming from his individual perspective, and may or may not be entirely reflective of the TRC or the CMAQ. But one of the biggest strengths about the MAC and about our process is that we have such a wide variety of individuals that lend their knowledge and their expertise into the development of the MAC and the chart of work that we have. And when you start expanding the circles to gain different voices, it definitely can make things interesting. But we value everyone that has contributed in any form or fashion. I'd like to recognize Tom Klukner. Tom is another member of the cyanuric acid committee, and I know he has a few things he wants to say. So Tom, you have the floor for a couple of minutes.
Okay, I just wanted to expand a little bit. Richard hit on a little bit. Jim has made a lot of hay out of the comparison between the NSF calculation using the SWIM model and the WHO limit. I'd like to point out that the WHO was a fairly simple calculation based on a 1-year-old child ingesting 100 milliliters of water every day for an extended period of time. The SWIM model, and those numbers are kind of pulled out of the air, are very arbitrary numbers. I don't know of any parent that's going to take their child to a pool every day and let them drink 100 mils of water. That's 0.4 cups of water every day from the pool. There is no scientific justification or substantiation for that number. It was just pulled out of the air. And their calculation is a chronic risk assessment, basically. It's based on the chronic toxicity limit from a chronic tox test. In contrast, the SWIM model assumes that a child visits the pool 102 days out of the year and then averages that exposure out of the year over the entire year. And so if that's like 1/3 of the time. And so if you do the same thing with the WHO model, average over 3 times the time, or use a much more reasonable ingestion rate, maybe 1/3 that amount, you'd end up with a number that was very similar. If if you'd use either one of those numbers, you'd end up with a number that's similar to the SWIM model. If you do both of those corrections, 3 times 3 is a factor of 9, you'd actually end up with a number that's considerably higher than the SWIM model predicts. And so the SWIM model is a much more reasonable, much more scientifically based calculation. It's a much more extensive calculation, and is also the model that EPA uses and NSF uses under NSF 50 to evaluate the toxicity of chemicals in swimming pools. And so you've made a lot out of that comparison, but look at the details, James. The SWIM model is a lot better calculation, and the 300 parts per million is a much more reasonable number.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick sides, just saying that, you know, if you have two models, you have to decide. And when the change requests don't even mention the other model, it's kind of hard to kind of evaluate and do these sorts of things. But regardless of the toxicity limit, there's still an operational limit. And that's what I was trying to say in the talk today, is it's not all about toxicity. It's about, you know, can you disinfect the pool efficiently? And, you know, Richard would say ORP is not important, you know, but the MAC is requiring ORP controllers. So, you know, I don't know how to fix all these problems, but they seem contradictory to me.
The MAC
Great,
does
thank
not ORP on every pool.
you, everybody. Thank you, everyone. So one thing a couple of things I want to point out before we break for caucusing. Number one is, you know, as we look at research, the beauty is the stabilizer committee is not done with their chart of work. This is just the beginning. There's been an exceptional amount of time put in, and there's many, many more questions. And the committee will be working probably for quite some time to look at all the different variables about how cyanuric acid is used and should be used in recreational water venues. I also just wanted to address something that was in chat about the lack of public health on committees. Can't speak to why, because that precedes the current staff at CMAQ. We do know that at various points, individuals with a strong public health background were involved in the committee. But, you know, at CMAQ, we realized that, you know, one thing we do need is a larger public health voice reflected in our committees. So we'll be looking at how to address that in the future. With that being said, we have, it's 10 till 5, and we have our next caucusing at 5 p.m. So just want to encourage this discussion to continue in your caucusing groups. And remember that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, we'll have an open forum where all are welcome to explore and discuss this topic in much more detail. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in your caucus groups in 10 minutes. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, James. Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, thanks, everybody. Some great discussion. I look forward to tomorrow. Please, I'm sure everyone's kind of writing down their questions and points they want to make tomorrow when we have the open forum. Obviously, please discuss in your caucus groups, and we'll see you all back in this main session tomorrow morning, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern. So thank you again for a great day 2. Thank you to all of our presenters, and we'll see you back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. Thank you.
Thank you.